Good morning, and we welcome you to Bluemont this morning, where this summer we're worshiping out under the picnic shelter each day. This Sunday, we're beginning another series of sermons on a book of the Bible, and this time it's the book of Daniel. This is an interesting and somewhat controversial book within what we call the Old Testament. In the Jewish Bible, which has the same books of the Old Testament as ours, it's placed differently. We place it in the Christian Bible as among the prophets, but in the Jewish Bibles you'll find it under the writings, which includes the histories and things like Psalms and wisdom literature. There are other controversies about Daniel. He's not the most accurate historian. His dating of events are often in conflict with 1st and 2nd Kings and Jeremiah. He also gets some of the details confused. In today's reading, we're told about King Nebuchadnezzar coming and defeating Israel in this first conflict between these two powers, but Nebuchadnezzar was not king at this time. He would soon become king, but he was the crown prince. But that's a minor fact. There's also debate among scholars as to the dating, as to when this book was written. Some want to say it was written during Babylon, in that period, while others suggest it was written in the 2nd century before Christ. Or, as I tend to lean, I think the book was probably written later, but they took and collected these stories that came from much earlier, that came from the Babylonian period. While the dating of Daniel is uncertain, what is certain is that the book involves how one might live faithfully when society challenges one's faith. When we consider the book in this light, there is much that we can learn and apply to our lives today. Daniel provides hope, for we learn that despite what happens, God is still in control, and God is still working out his purposes in the world. Our opening text will be the first 7 verses of Daniel, which kind of sets up for the stories that we're going to be listening to over the next several weeks or couple months. In the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim of Judea, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let Jehoiakim of Judea fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenazar, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of their nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, incompetent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As you know, I spent 2 weeks away, and one of those 2 weeks was dedicated as a time of study and reading. I settled in on a house that was overlooking the St. Mary's River in northern Michigan. This is where the freighters make their turns as they come up out of the lower Great Lakes. It's Michigan and Huron and Erie, and are heading up to pick up the iron ore up in Ontario and into western part of Lake Superior. So there I was along the shores of the lake, of this channel actually, between the lakes, and I was armed with a stack of books. In addition to the Bible, my stack included a couple of commentaries on Daniel, Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, and a brand new biography of Karl Barth that had just been released in English. Now, on the surface, it may seem that these books have nothing to do with each other. I mean, Thurman, who was a classmate of Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, wrote for the African American community back in the 1930s and 40s. Barth, a Swiss theologian who had taught in Germany, found himself exiled from Germany in 1935 for being critical of the Nazi Party. And then there was Daniel. I found a thread that seemed to run through all of these books. And I sum it up with this question: how do we live faithfully when we have lost almost everything? Growing up in South Florida in the first half of the 20th century, Thurman addresses this topic for his readers who were oppressed. In a way, they didn't have much to lose, except perhaps for their dignity. As for Barth, he was forced from a prestigious chair of theology. He even lost the distinction to be called doctor when the German university revoked his title. But both Thurman and Barth found that there was something more important than titles and than even life itself. And what's important is how we might be faithful to our Lord Jesus Christ. God must come first in our lives. And the book of Daniel begins at a low point in Hebrew history. Israel has been defeated. Part of the temple treasury is now sitting in the treasury of Babylonian gods. Some of Israel's brightest and most distinguished and promising young men have been hauled away in exile. This was the first invasion by Babylon in 605 BC. Israel would be attacked and defeated 2 more times by the Babylonians, the last resulting in the destruction of the temple in 587 BC, at a time when most of the population was led into exile. But that all would come later. What happened to Jerusalem when she was first defeated is that Babylon, in a way to require compliance in the territories, the conquered territories, took some of the leading young men for training in Babylon. Now, on one level, they're hostages. But these dudes are also lucky. I mean, they're being sent to an elite school. They're provided with good food, good living quarters, and they're being taught by some of the best teachers in the city. This is an old strategy that's still in use. The Chinese Communist Party pulls some of the most promising students from their ethnic minorities, which are often in the western part of China, And they relocate them into the eastern part of the country so that they can be educated into the ways of the Han Chinese. Now, just so we won't feel too good about ourselves, we kind of did the same thing with Native American youth who were relocated, many to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where there was an Indian school. And the hope of that kind of strategy is that these educated students will become leaders within their community and that they will encourage everyone to accept and adopt the dominant culture. In Babylon's case, it was also to have trained interpreters who could speak and write both languages because they're quite different. But the problem with such a system is that something is always lost. Those who are taken lose their connection to their families and their heritage, and in many cases, to their religion. In the case of the Hebrews taken away during the first and second exiles, which included people like Daniel and his 3 friends, and also Ezekiel, they lost that connection to their homeland and to the temple that was so important for their religion. And in a way, it seems as if they might have even lost their God. Because you see, in the ancient world, a nation's deity was seen as having power over where you lived. And when you were defeated in battle, it was easy to assume that your enemy's gods are more powerful than your God. However, Daniel, at the very beginning of this book, makes it clear that the God of Israel, who is the God with the capital G, the God over all, is still God even over these other gods. Because in the second verse we're told here that God allowed this all to happen. God allowed his own people to be defeated. God gave his own people to Babylon. Obviously, our God practices tough love. But this was a secret for the Hebrews in exile. I'm sure it wasn't something they were telling the Babylonians, but it was their secret for them and for later generations, because they would look back and see that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of creation, is the God over all. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar could do what he wanted to do, including stealing from the temple and giving those objects to his own God. But that really did not make God weaker, because Nebuchadnezzar didn't know this. But Nebuchadnezzar was being used by God, by the God, for a purpose that was larger than his own kingdom. So the Babylonians hauled off some of Jerusalem's finest young men. We're not told their age, but they're at a point in life where they're considered wise and capable of serving in the king's palace. My guess is that they were in their late teens or early 20s. They're young enough that they can still grasp another language, but old enough to have mastered being in the king's service. And now they're entering this 3-year program to serve new people. One of the first things that happens when they get to Babylon is that there's a name change. No longer will they go by their Hebrew names. They now have Babylonian names. In a way, it's almost like their identity is being stolen. When someone assigns you a name, someone outside your parents, they attempt to show a control that they have over you by giving you that name and using that name. These Hebrew young men no longer have that kind of control over their own lives, as we're going to see in the next month or so. Roger Klon, the great baseball writer, wrote about having lunch with Jackie Robinson, the first African American to play in the major leagues. It was a few years after Robinson retired, and at the time, Robinson was working on an autobiography, and he invited Pond to give him some advice and to help him out in this endeavor. And while they were in this restaurant eating and chatting, this man came up to their table and kind of leaned over and said, "Could you be a good boy and give me your autograph?" Robinson blew up. "What'd you call me?" Shaken, the man kind of backed away, and then he re-asked the question a little more politely. "That wasn't what you said," Robinson countered. And then he asked who the autograph was for, and when the man said it was for his grandson, Robinson consented and signed the autograph. When the man left, Plon asked Robinson if he wasn't being a little too hard on the man. And Robinson laughed it off and said, "Well, that'll be the last time he calls a black man a boy." When you have the power to name, you have the power over what you name. It's a biblical concept. You see it at the very beginning of Genesis, where God gave Adam the right to name the animals. It was a power that expresses human dominion over creation. Our four Hebrew friends that we meet at the opening verses of Daniel were given new names by the Babylonians, become examples of how to live in a society that attempts to change us in ways that ultimately challenge and change our faith. Daniel is a good book for the church to explore at a time when we have lost much of our influence in the world. From this book, we learn that even though we may have lost influence, that God is still God. And in the end, what matters is our faithfulness to this God. And the question we're left with, when we, like Daniel, have lost all that is important, is this: is God enough?